Welcome to the Webster World Report, a program sharing the expertise of Webster University's global system while the world is in crisis. Here's our host, Rick Rockwell.
Less than a month remains before perhaps the most important election in the United States in 150 years, and most experts agree that's not hyperbole. But is the situation as dire as it seems? We'll engage two of Webster University's political experts on that question and more on this edition of the Webster World Report. But first, let's hear from newscaster Tiara Gray.
Top officials from Webster University took part in the opening of the United Nations 75th session in September. They lent their expertise to a virtual panel on issues faced by women of the African diaspora. Webster's Chancellor Beth Stroble was one of the organizers of the event.
Young people, and especially young women, must be provided the support and platform to advocate for their rights and be strong supporters of gender equality. This is especially true for women and girls who face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, including racial discrimination.
Clementina Acedo, the director of Webster's campus in Geneva, Switzerland, spoke about the importance of education for women.
This is important also because not only is a human right, but it's what education is what empowers women to achieve development and to achieve sustainable development and peace.
The panel was part of the Women of the Diaspora Global Virtual Summit, sponsored by the United Nations, the Republic of Costa Rica, and the African Renaissance and Diaspora Network. The university's video series called Webster Speaks featured the voices of activists and students speaking about issues of race, equity, and inclusion on virtual panels in September. During one program, Tori Russell of the International Black Freedom Alliance spoke about his view of the Black experience.
America can never love us, even though my father fought for the country. That's the thing that we are, that truth, to tell that truth in the 21st century, because now I break down the lie that America is not a democracy. It is, it is fascist. It's always been a white supremacist country.
Earlier in September, the video series featured some of the university's SUGS scholars discussing issues of race. Scholar Brene Jackson was one of the speakers.
I don't think that people recognize that when we say Black Lives Matter, it's not saying, oh, only Black Lives Matter. It's saying that Black Lives Matter too. So it's like we're declaring that they matter because nobody else is declaring it. Nobody else is recognizing the importance of our lives. It's almost as if we're disposable.
All of these Webster Speaks programs can be found on the university's YouTube channel. The next program will be on Wednesday, October 14th, and will feature members of the university's Board of Trustees as they discuss how people of color can gain positions of power in the corporate boardroom. Registration information for the series can be found on the university's website. Webster University earned its highest ranking in the annual analysis by U.S. News and World Report on the top colleges in the United States. Webster moved up several positions and is now ranked in 15th place among regional universities in the Midwest. Overall, the Midwest category consists of rankings of 157 universities in the Midwest region. U.S. News and World Report has offered these rankings since 1983, and it cited Webster for its value and as being a top school for veterans. The university also earned praise for providing positive social mobility for its graduates and for having economic diversity among its students. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, the university offered numerous virtual events in September, including virtual homecoming sessions. Various university leaders spoke to a virtual gathering for the annual Alumni Awards, including Webster University's President Julian Schuster.
The community of Webster University is a family. These alumni have excelled in community service, in social justice, in civic leadership, in leading in their chosen professions, and in engaging other alumni.
The entire Webster community is hoping for a return to in-person events and homecoming next year. For the Webster World Report, I'm Tiara Gray.
Thanks, Tiara. Our shout out this time goes to our listeners in Thailand. Although most of this program's listeners are in the United States, Thailand is now the country with the most listeners outside of the U.S. So thanks to our listeners in Thailand and elsewhere around the globe. And now on to our panel of political experts discussing the presidential elections in the U.S. We spoke to Bill Hall and Gwyneth Williams, both political scientists at Webster University. Both of them joined us via Zoom from St. Louis, Missouri. Our discussion was recorded at the end of September, before President Donald Trump contracted the coronavirus. I know it's a bit unusual to ask this question about an election in the United States, but President Donald Trump recently said he couldn't guarantee a peaceful transfer of power if he lost the election. Is this election now about the future of democracy in the United States?
In the time of taking public opinion polls, we're sort of at the height of people's distrust of governmental institutions, whether that comes from the right, the left, or the middle. And both sides in this election are desperately afraid that the other side will manipulate and steal the election. I think both sides are lawyering up, as we say. And with the pandemic and the fact that so many people will be voting by mail, how the whole election counting will go will be different than anything in modern history. Several of the battleground states have said they will count votes as long as they're coming in, as long as they're, postmarked by Election Day. So we could have delayed results. I do think the president's comments saying that he wouldn't necessarily accept the election results are very problematic. I think it is great that so many Republicans in Congress immediately lined up to say, yes, we will accept election results. They didn't directly diss the president, but they came out saying it very quickly and did not defend him. Now, there are some caveats being made on that statement by some of Trump's supporters saying, we'll accept a ruling by the Supreme Court. I mean, presuming that it would go to the court, be a Bush v. Gore type of thing, and saying they would accept that, which does imply that they wouldn't necessarily accept the election results as they are ultimately reported and the electoral votes counted in the middle of December. I think it's a problem that there is so much distrust on both sides. I guess I do want to say, for President Trump to actually say, no, I refuse to be removed from office, and that actually happening would involve a lot of officials acting in ways that I think are highly unlikely for them to act. It would involve the military, the top military, who actually I don't think have any love for him at the moment, giving orders for martial law or whatever. It would involve so many different actors having to carry out, that kind of order, that I'm not sure that I'm that afraid that scenario will happen. But I think that unless one side or the other wins in an obvious landslide, which I think is highly unlikely to happen, the losing side is going to feel that the election was stolen. And I think that is problematic on down the line for our trust of institutions.
Professor Bill Hall, your thoughts?
A good question. And I would agree with much of what Gwyneth has just said. I would also take a bit different perspective. I am less inclined to believe that in the gloom and doom scenarios that you're hearing bandied around so much. In some ways, I would interpret a characterization of this election as Donald Trump versus democracy a little bit over dramatic. My knowledge of history, particularly political history, lets me believe that there have been far more potentially devastating elections in presidential history. Certainly the election of 1864, where Lincoln had to stand for a re-election, despite the fact that during his whole first term in office, we were at war. We survived that election, and certainly with the country torn in two, in many ways, I would argue that was a much more serious time for us. Certainly during wartime, there have been elections where circumstances were as difficult or as strained as some would lead us to believe that they are now. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, while this is a very serious time, I'm not on page for saying that this is the end all and be all. I think life will go on after the election of November 3rd. And I also have a view that it's not going to be as close as many of the number crunchers would lead us to believe. I think in some ways, it may turn out to be a landslide. And the reason why I say that is because I've always been a strong believer in the American people. And I've always leaned toward wanting to support what I feel would be intelligence on the part of the American people. And I just do not see a scenario where certain candidates are going to be reelected out of faith and hope and trust in the good judgment of the American people.
Interesting to hear we're talking about the election of 1864 in this year when racial politics are so important, and interesting to hear Bill paraphrasing President Lincoln in regards to trust for the American people. But like that period, do we face a rebuilding of our institutions after this election?
I don't want it to sound like I think that all of a sudden the institutions have been damaged. I meant to be saying two different things. One is the long increasing distrust of institutions going back a couple of decades. It's been a steady erosion of trust of institutions.
Distrust that began with Watergate and the Nixon administration.
Right. And then on top of that, then the particular conditions of the pandemic, making the voting system, sort of all the cards have been thrown up in the air with so much more mail-in voting, though again, mail-in voting had been conducted by some states without incident for a while. I do want to say that I'm in total agreement with Bill that when you take a historical perspective of this, we are not in a unique crisis. I was trying to contextualize it in terms of, say, the last few decades, but Bill is, right on the nose. The election, in addition to 1864, the election of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, which was incredibly contentious. Jefferson won, and as a lame duck, John Adams packed the courts. He and his allies in Congress, all of whom were going to be leaving, put in all these new judgeships and packed the courts. The election of 1876, which an independent commission had to end up counting the votes, and Rutherford B. Hayes, who had lost the electoral vote, ended up winning the election. And the deal that he made, which was a cataclysmically horrible deal, was that he would end Reconstruction and withdraw all the troops from the South, which was then just devastating to the country for decades and decades and decades. So I'm totally on board with what Bill is saying, that when you're taking the long perspective, It's not like we've never seen anything like this before. I think in the last few decades, this is particularly troubling, though.
You're listening to the Webster World Report. Our guests today are Gwyneth Williams and Bill Hall, both political scientists at Webster University, and both joining us via Zoom from St. Louis, Missouri. We'll have more of our discussion on presidential politics in a moment.
When you visit Webster Athens, one word comes to mind: value. Study in Greece at Webster Athens and get an unparalleled educational experience through various innovative undergraduate, graduate, and study abroad programs. The campus of Webster Athens lies right below the Acropolis at the confluence of Europe, Asia, and Africa. To join our learning community, email athensadmissions@webster.edu or visit www.webster.edu.gr.
Webster Vienna Private University is welcoming students this fall semester with our new normal in mind. With health and safety as top priorities, we offer hybrid class attendance options, online or in small-sized classrooms. We're ready for the new norm so that we can continue to focus on what matters most, our students and the Webster Vienna community. Learn more by visiting webster.ac.at.
Welcome back to the Webster World Report. Our guests today are Gwyneth Williams and Bill Hall, political science professors at Webster University, both joining us via Zoom from St. Louis, Missouri. Our conversation was recorded before President Trump's illness. Bill, we've seen a summer of unrest in America. We recorded this during the week of the protests nationwide regarding the refusal to issue charges against police in Louisville in the death of Breonna Taylor. Of course, the protests and sometimes riots we've seen started with the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Has President Trump found a way to spin these protests for social justice and make it work for him with his law and order agenda?
I would argue that it's working, in my view, to the administration's disadvantage. While it does provide proverbial red meat for his base, I think two things. First of all, one of the biggest hurdles that I think that this current administration has before it in order to be successfully reelected is the fact that it doesn't appear to be a good knowledge of really the role of the president. In my interpretation of the founding fathers was to be a uniter of our country, not a divider. And once the campaign for election is over, then I believe, in my humble interpretation, the expectation for the founders was that whoever won the office of the presidency would be the president for all people in the United States, to represent the United States, not just concentrate on their power base. And that's a position or a perspective that I don't think this president has ever truly understood. And I don't think he understands it to this day. James Madison, one of the more important founding fathers, who's generally credited as among the most politically astute, was one of the authors of the 85 papers that we call the Federalist Papers, which was really the only primary source data available about the debates during the Constitutional Convention. And in Federalist Paper number 10, he identifies the dangers of factions as being something that we needed to be particularly concerned about, given our attempt to create an experiment in democracy and a republic. And by faction, he was concerned about an interest group that focused primarily in what's in the best interest of its members and supporters versus a more broader view of what's in the best interest of the country. And I see in the current administration some reflections of the same kinds of concerns that James Madison raised. You run to your base during the primary, but you run toward the broader electorate for the presidency. And I just don't see that happening in this particular campaign by this president.
Professor Gwyneth Williams.
If we're looking at the issue of race very specifically, not only in this election, but what we understand about it from 2016, a number of social scientists, political scientists, sociologists, social psychologists did research on what motivated people's votes for Donald Trump in 2016. And there are a ton of studies out there, all cast in slightly different ways. There was a great deal of discussion right after the election about what motivated particularly people who might have voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. And there was a lot written about, well, it was the white working class vote, and the issue was the economy, that the Democrats really hadn't done enough for the working class, and they felt that Trump would. So the explanation was an economic explanation. The research that has been done on attitudes among people and correlations of votes for Trump show that that actually is not particularly accurate, that it is not necessarily the case that economic desperation or lower income predicted a vote for Donald Trump. In any election, party ID is the single biggest predictor of a vote. But what they found, and this is not my opinion, as I said, there are tons of studies on this, is that attitudes about race and against immigration, and some studies also in terms of attitudes about sex, were the biggest predictors of votes for Trump, particularly those who had voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. And I think the assumption often was, well, if someone was willing to vote for Obama, then they must not have any kind of racial ideology. And so they must have then voted for Trump, not for racist reasons. But a lot of attitudes towards race are latent attitudes, like we have about everything. And it depends what issues become salient in a particular election cycle, that whether or not people begin to think in those terms. And there was a lot of discourse by Donald Trump in 2016 about anti-immigration, about people from Mexico, about African Americans, linking it to language about crime and social problems. And that then can ignite a lot of those attitudes. In 2016, as Bill said earlier, it wasn't the economy, stupid. It really was much more about issues of race and national identity.
Final thoughts. Are we headed to a legally contested election?
We should be slow to panic. Do I see the potentiality for cause for concern? Certainly I do, but have I reached for the panic button? No. Again, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, I'm a believer in the faith and integrity of the American people. And the old saying that you can fool all of the people some of the time, some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all of the people, is so true. And I think this too shall pass. I'm caution myself to get too discombobulated over what others may be stressed out and panicked over. I just have faith in the American people because they have time and time again proved the pundits wrong. Who would have seen Barack Obama? Okay, who saw that coming? I'm old enough that for my first election was Harry Truman. Now, obviously, I was very young. But,
so you didn't vote for Harry Truman. You're not that old, Bill.
But I had checked in. No, okay, I was here. And as a matter of fact, I was born in 1948. And that, in many ways, was one of the most remarkable elections. Nobody predicted Harry Truman would beat Thomas Dewey. Nobody, except Harry Truman. So again, I'm always cautious. I try to look at things objectively. And the one thing that keeps me grounded is faith in the American people. They can spot a phony. Sometimes it takes a while. And I'm not trying to articulate or identify who I believe is a phony. That's up to the American people. But they can spot one when they see one. And I think we have to give more credit in the integrity and the good judgment of the American people.
It always makes me feel better every time I talk to Bill, run into him in the office or anything. He always makes me feel better. So it's a gift he has.
Well, thank you.
Are we headed for a contested election? If you mean, are we headed for an election that there may well be lawsuits in some states over the vote? I think, yes, we'll probably have some lawsuits in some states or localities about, the vote. Does that necessarily mean that it goes to the Supreme Court? Does that necessarily mean then these other, apocalyptic visions? I'm not at all convinced of that, as Bill said. I think I'm more dubious about a landslide than Bill is. I think it could well be close, particularly because of all the roadblocks at the moment to votes. And
well, if I can just one of them. I remember another couple elections. Certainly the election of '64, Barry Goldwater, who ran under a very strong law and order platform, a former senator from Arizona, who lost in a landslide to Lyndon Johnson. I also remember a Spiro T. Agnew, who was the vice president under Nixon, who coined the phrase, the silent majority. I think what we're fixing to see on November 3rd is there in fact still a concept as the silent majority? And if so, has that the texture and the perspective on the ideology of the silent majority changed?
Thanks to our guests today on the Webster World Report, Professors Bill Hall and Gwyneth Williams from Webster University, joining us via Zoom from St. Louis, Missouri.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks for listening to our program. The Webster World Report will return with a fresh edition on Friday, November 6th, 2020. We'd like to add your voices to our podcast. If you're a student, a staff member, or a member of the faculty, reach out to us. Send us a short audio clip from your cell phone or contact us via email to volunteer to be interviewed on the program. You can find us at covid19@webster.edu. You can also send questions or comments to that email address about our world in crisis. That address again is covid19@webster.edu. Also, check out the university's COVID-19 resource pages at webster.edu/COVID-19. The Webster World Report is now available on iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and of course, SoundCloud. You can also hear the program on your Alexa speaker via TuneIn. Also, our report is featured on KWRH-FM Radio 63119. That's 92.9 FM in Webster Groves, Missouri. Thanks for joining us this week. The Webster World Report is produced by students, staff, and faculty at Webster University. For announcer Tara Graves, news reporter Tiara Gray, and associate producer Jennifer Gamich, I'm Rick Rockwell. Stay healthy and safe.
The Webster World Report is produced by the Global Marketing and Communications Division of Webster University and through the facilities and copyright support of Webster School of Communications. This program is copyright 2020.